Hi, welcome to the channel. I'm Saul, the creator of the Summoner's Nexus TCG, an indie digital trading card game that is coming your way very, very soon. That is just so many words to say. Anyway, in the lead up to the release of the game, I wanted to start releasing lore, card details, just various things to teach you a little bit more about what has gone into making it over these 3+ years. And so today I would like to take you through a minor subset in the game called the Valiant subset. Now, if you are interested in trading card games, digital or otherwise, consider subscribing so you can follow the development and eventual release of the game, or join our Discord community down below so that you can, get in touch with the community, or do both, really. And please leave a like on the video because it helps us to reach more potential players, which means more people for you to play against. So the Valiant subset, this is one of the minor subsets in the game, which means that it's basically just made to mix in with other decks and strategies to allow for more deck building variety. The main idea behind this deck is that it's supposed to support other strategies, and it is very support focused. It's all about defense. It's all about being played defensively to protect you and stop you from dying. Now, the art design in this subset is, for this card in particular, I just think he looks so cool. I love the way that this deck ended up coming out. The rank 2 also looks really good. I used to hate the way that the rank 3 looked because when it was trapped inside of the border, you'll notice it with all of the other cards, they stay fully inside of their borders, but with any rank 3 card in the game, it protrudes out of the border. And that was because with the rank 3s all having 3 different effects, I needed a way to make it so that you could actually see what was going on with the card. Before, you couldn't see his card art at all, but now that he comes out of it and you can see what he looks like, I actually really like this one too. So across the board, I feel like this is a good subset art direction wise. Now, this subset is one of, if not the first minor subset to be included into the game, and so it's from a time when the game was going to be 3D. I was purchasing assets on the Unity asset store to then use as the basis for card art in order to sort of save costs because I am an indie developer. And so this subset is based on an asset, but then it's different enough that you can distinguish it from the asset. But if you were to see them side by side, you might be able to tell, like, okay, yeah, this is what this is from. So as a result of that, like, it's limited in terms of like the design elements. I decided to have the castle in the back, but besides that, there wasn't really much to do in terms of like deciding what the cards would look like. That being said, I decided on the poses and like the styles for the armor, so it's changed a little bit from what the asset was based on. Now, with that being said, this subset being one of the first to be a minor subset, I was so scared with, right? Because I had never played around with the idea of a minor subset before at that point. You see, in this game, instead of having a ban list, I'm balancing it around a synergy system where cards need to be with the members of their subset to work properly. You have 10 spaces for cards in your deck, and so if my synergy rating is 8, for example, then that means you need 8 cards from my deck for you to actually be able to pilot said deck, and that means you only have room for 2 other cards, which means those cards would need a synergy rating of 2 to be viable. There's generic cards you can use to fill those slots, and 8 is a pretty high synergy rating. You usually see like 6 or 7, but that was sort of the core foundation of the game. So with this being introduced to fill that gap, I was very nervous. I was very hesitant because it's like, okay, this deck was built around or based around not being able to be played with any other decks. Well, now this is a deck that is intended to be played with it, and it is defense oriented. So for example, let's say you have an offensive major subset that has its whole identity around like, okay, we're going to go all in on offense and we don't have very many defensive options. Well, this fills that gap completely. So it's like, okay, will this then break that subset? And that was a very difficult mentality to escape. And I say escape because this deck taught me that minor subsets need to be like broken to be broken. You see, the thing about a minor subset is that it's not like it just fills a gap or just like adds something to the deck without taking anything away, because what it takes away is card placement, right? Now you have 10 cards in your starting hand, 5 avatars and 5 runes. So you choose your best 5 cards for the avatars that go into your hand. Now let's say you've put in a minor subset to fill a given gap. Awesome, but that means that there is now a card missing from your initial strategy. Some decks don't mind this too much, but I found that give and take was enough to keep most things balanced, and I actually overtuned this deck significantly when I first put it into the game. I had to buff them like quite a bit. So the only card in this deck that ever saw play was Damien, right? But the problem is, since Damien has a synergy rating of 3, you have to play the other 2 in your resource deck in order to use Damien's actually good effect, and the other 2 are basically just bricks that you didn't want to draw into. So Damien's defense is at 0, but he's a defender, and the reason for that is in order for a card to defend you in this game, it doesn't need to have any stats because cards can only attack once. So if my opponent has 1 attacking card, it doesn't matter what stats the card in front of it has. If I've got anything to defend myself, they won't be able to attack directly. Now, Damien Damien's effect says, hey, if I'm about to be attacked and I would be destroyed by that attack, negate that attack, right? So he just stops one of your opponent's attacks. And if your opponent has a second monster, then yes, they can attack with the second monster, but that means no attacks get past him because your opponent can only summon 2 attacking monsters in a given turn under normal circumstances. So unless I've got an effect to get around that restriction, this single rank 1 card that only costs you 50 points from your life point gauge to summon just protected you from an entire turn of offensive assaults, right? Like that is really, really good. Now the problem was the other 2 cards, I couldn't even tell you what they did before. They may as well have not done anything because there was not a single time, and I mean a single time in testing where either of their effects was even remotely relevant, right? Like it was they were bad. Like it was just really, really bad. And they've also got 0 on their stats. I think the idea was that this card on summon was supposed to increase their stats, and it did that previously as well, but there were 2 problems. 1, it didn't increase their stats by enough, and 2, because it was in your resource deck and not your starting hand, the odds that you randomly draw it and then randomly draw another Valiant monster to use with it just weren't very high, so you never got that effect off, and it just wasn't satisfying to play. Now, the concept behind this deck was just stopping your opponent's attacks, and so Dariel and Darius, they all have D names, Dariel, Darius, and Damien. Those 2 have an ability called Last Stand, where if they got destroyed, they prevent your opponent from attacking anyone else. So it's supposed to be a thing of like, okay, you know, they had this Valiant Last Stand, Valiant, you see that's it's in the name, and they stopped your opponent from going any further by sacrificing themselves. And in their lore, they are Valiant warriors who do something akin to that, but do they survive actually in the lore? I guess you'll have to read it to find out. But in any event, they are a defensive pairing, and they just weren't very good. And in concept I was like, oh yeah, it's this really epic thing that they'll be able to do to stop your opponent from going any further. But in Summoner's Nexus, your opponent gets to choose which cards they attack. So let's say they have 1 attacking monster and you have 2 defending monsters. Awesome, great. And this guy has his Last Stand ability. Awesome, great. I just won't attack him first. I'll just attack the other card first, and he'll never get the ability off. And so the first thing that I did to try and buff that, to buff this effect, was I made it a status condition, which was something that was more consistent. This actually, in fairness, that actually wasn't to benefit the deck, that was to benefit the player, because what I found was that I was having too many random one-off effects that only came up once and were like, it made the game more bloated, whereas if this was a status condition, it's something that I can call back to when designing other cards, and it's a lot more streamlined for the player to be able to understand. So a card that breaks the attacking card's chain of momentum and stops it from going any further, well, that's called making that enemy card fatigued, right? Cool. So that didn't actually help this effect at all. What really helped this effect was the introduction of a rune called Smoke Grenade. Now, Smoke Grenade says that if a card is selected for an attack of yours, you can activate Smoke Grenade and then give a different card priority, which is a different status condition, which says that cards with priority must be attacked before anything else. So the idea now is you give this card priority, make your opponent attack into it, and then stop their attack. So it's a way of just canceling your opponent's main offensive strike for a given turn, but it only really works if you have that specific card at your disposal. So this deck isn't that great at standing alone, and it's supposed to be a minor subset. It's supposed to be supporting a larger archetype, but what I decided was to buff the primary effects of these cards. I wanted to keep that theme of them having their Valiant Last Stand, so I didn't actually change the secondary effect that both Darius and Dariel share, right? Damien doesn't have it because he didn't have space for it, and I really liked the way his effect worked, right? And it felt like it would be too broken to give all of them Damien's effect, so instead I just made them stronger in other ways. So what I made it was so that if you control at least 2 Valiant avatars, your opponent can only target Valiant avatars you control during the next battle phase. So that's a way to guarantee that another card can get its Last Stand effect off, but also if your opponent tries to target anything that isn't Valiant monster, it won't work, which means that, like, for example, let's say you don't have any Valiant monsters in your defense zone. Let's say that you activated this effect and then put this card somewhere else. If you've got nothing in your defense zone, if you've got another type of monster, if you've got anything that isn't a Valiant monster, they just cannot attack you, which is situationally very, very good, right? And this card instead of just boosting the Valiant monster's defense when it gets summoned, it can now boost everything. Like, it boosts the defense of everything you control by 100. So in theory, if you summon this card, you can get, well, they're probably only going to be 3 monsters in your defense zone, so 300 points of defense off of that, plus anything else you've got. Plus, it gives Valiant monsters an additional 50 defense. Like, I went in when trying to make them relevant so that they weren't just dead weight alongside Damien, so they now both have something useful that they do aside from just, you know, being paperweights, basically. This card can also tribute a different Valiant card to increase its defense by another 150 if you wanted to do that. So this card can get pretty stacked, which is why they all start at 0. I mean, they started at 0 before he could get really stacked, but it's why I didn't improve that portion of their stats, because it's like, okay, I've done it a different way, so that's absolutely fine. Now, interestingly enough, with this subset, I actually hired someone on Fiverr to create the lore for them, because I was writing the book that this game is based off of, as well as a bunch of the lore for other subsets. So I was like, okay, how can I get more lore done more quickly? And I hired this person to make 2 stories for this subset, and I believe the Gladiator subset. And the story that they wrote for the Gladiator subset just wasn't it, unfortunately. But the story that they wrote for this, I was like, okay, I'm gonna tweak this. I'm gonna tweak this quite a bit, but there's something here. And so I did some rewriting and got it to a point where I was happy with it. And so that is where the lore for this subset comes from. Because it was outsourced, I'm not as connected to the story. Like, I gave them the general beats that I wanted the story to follow. But this is probably the subset with the lore that I am the least personally, like, invested in. So I don't personally care about, like, the personalities and struggles of these individual 3 cards like I might with other subsets, like the Arya subset or the Gladiator subset, where I was very invested in their lore, and I like the story of their lore a lot, and the individual cards get, like, good moments to shine. So I mean, still read it. It's still fun. Maybe you'll like it more than I do, but that's why this deck isn't my favorite subset lore-wise, but it is one of my favorite minor subsets, just because, like, the defensive options that it can add to certain decks and, like, filling gaps that certain decks might have is just really, really good. So yeah, that is everything about the Valiant subset, at least that comes to mind off the top of my head. Should I start writing scripts for these videos? I don't think so. I feel like it's more fun to just, like, say what I remember of them, because the things that stand out the most are probably the most interesting to hear from my memory anyway. So thank you very much for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to subscribe so you can see more content like this and prepare for the release of the game. Join the Discord to find out how to get involved in the open beta for the game, and leave a like once again because it really helps us out. Have a wonderful day and take care. Bye.